Welcome to the Drowsy Podcast. Can you hear the rain sound? As you listen, imagine the world beyond your window. The rain dances on the rooftops, the wet streets, the leaves quenching their thirst. It's early spring where I live right now, and the cherry blossoms are starting to bloom. After the rain tomorrow, maybe the grass will be greener and the street will be covered in pink petals. How amazing is that? I always find myself sleep much better knowing it's raining outside, knowing that you're safe from the storm outside, safely tucked in, and feeling the warmth seeping into your bones. And so as you drift, let's continue with the next pages of Olivia by Dorothy Strachey. Chapter 3. I had been at Les Enfants about a week when one evening after dinner it was announced that Mademoiselle Julie was going to read for us. Signorina came running up to me with sparkling eyes. She was almost as young as I was, and I never looked upon her as a governess or a superior. "Oh, Olivia mia, che piacere! You like it? I know you will." We collected, in while there was no compulsion. After we had taken our seats, little Signorina flitted in and out among us, visiting who was sewing and giving them advice, help, admiration, and scorn. I came in for the latter. "Not like sewing," she cried. "Great lazy one. Come and look at mine." She took me up to a little stool which was placed close behind a tall, straight armchair, evidently reserved for Mademoiselle Julie, and showed me her own piece of embroidery, so delicate, so filmy, so dainty, made with such exquisite lawn and adorned with such tiny stitches, that I exclaimed, "Oh, but I'm not a fairy." As we were laughing together, Mademoiselle Julie came in. She gave Signorina a glance as she passed. "Little vanity," she said, and went on her chair. Signorina turned scarlet, took up her work with a dejected air, and was just going to sit down on a stool when Frau Riesener came in. "Mademoiselle Curdle wants you to make her tisane, Mademoiselle Bachetto," she said. "You're the only person who makes it properly." "Oh," said Signorina. "But I asked her before dinner whether she would be wanting it, and she said she wouldn't." "Well," said Frau Riesener, "she wants it now." Signorina cast an appealing glance at Mademoiselle Julie, who looked at her gravely and said, "Go, my child." Then, as Signorina went reluctantly out, she took up her book and began turning over the pages. In the meantime, I had slipped back to my own seat at the other end of the room. "I am going to read you Racin's Andromaque," said Mademoiselle Julie, "but before I begin, I'll ask you a few questions. Has anybody here ever heard of Andromaque?" Apparently, nobody ever had. At any rate, there was a silence. Come, she said. "You can't all be as badly educated as that." After another pause, I plucked up my courage and piped down. "Hector's wife." "Yes? And who was Orest's father?" I answered this too to her satisfaction. Hadn't I browsed upon Pope's Homer since the age of 12 and eked it out with reading innumerable tales of Greek mythologies. She went on with her questions, and I answered them until it came to Hermione. "And Hermione?" she asked. I had never heard of Hermione. "Ah," she said. "Well, tonight you shall hear of her, and I hope never forget her. But as you answered so well, come here and sit beside me." She beckoned me up and made me take poor little Signorina's stool close to her elbow. Then, after lecturing us for a minute on the importance of mythology, she rapidly explained the situation at Pyrrhus' court, took up the book and began. "Oui, puisque je retrouve un ami si fidèle." I have often wondered what share Raisin had in lighting the flame that began to burn in my heart that night, or what share proximity. If she hadn't read just that play, or if she hadn't caught me up by chance to sit so near to her in such immediate contact with the inflammable stuff which I carried so unsuspectingly within me, had remained perhaps outside the radius of the kindling spark and never caught fire at all. But probably not. Sooner or later, it was bound to happen. There was a table in front of her with a lamp on it, which cast its light on her book and her face. I, sitting beside and below her, saw her illuminated and almost in profile. I looked at her for the first time as I listened. I don't know which I did more thirstily, looked or listened. It suddenly dawned upon me that this was beauty, great beauty, a thing I had read of and heard of without understanding, a thing I had passed by perhaps 100 times, with careless, unseeing eyes. Pretty girl I had seen, lovely girls no doubt, but I'd never paid attention to their looks, never been particularly interested in them. But there was something different. No, it was not different. It was merely being awakened to something for the first time, physical beauty. I was never blind to it again. Who can describe a face? Who can forbear trying to? But such descriptions resolve themselves in an inventory of items. As item, a rather broad face, a low forehead, dark hair with a thread or two grey in it, parted in the middle, gently waving on the temples, and gathered up in a bunch of curls at the back of the head, a curious kind of hairdressing which I had never seen except in pictures or in statues. The features were regular, cleanly cut and delicately formed, nose, lips and chin fine and firm. The eyes were grey, sometimes clear and translucid, sometimes dark, impenetrable, burning. It was thanks to Raisin that night that I saw a little of what they could express. What a strange relationship exists between the reader and his listener. What an extraordinary breaking down of barriers. A listener is certainly given the freedom of a city at whose gates he would never have dreamt of knocking. He may enter forbidden precincts. He may communicate at the most sacred altars with a soul he had never dared, never will dare approach, watch without fear or shame a spirit that had dropped its arms, its veils, its prudence, its reserves. He who is not beloved may gaze and hearken and learn at last what nothing else will ever reveal to him, and what he longs to know, even at the cost of life itself, how the beloved face is moved by passion, how scorn sits upon the features, and anger and love, how the beloved's voice softens and trembles into tenderness, or breaks into the anguish of jealousy and grief. Oh, but it is too soon to say it all. All these are reflections of a later date. I've heard of many readers read Racine, and famous men among them, but I have not heard any who read him as well as Mademoiselle Julie. She read simply and rapidly, without any of the actor's arts and affectations, with no swelling voice, with no gestures beyond the occasional lifting of her hand, in which she held a long ivory paper cutter. But the gravity of her bearings and her voice transported me at once into the courts of princes and the presence of great emotions. Avant de tout le grec, vous parlez pas ma voix. C'est vrai que je suis ici, me flatte de la joie. Et qu'à vos yeux, Seigneur, je montre quelque joie. De voir le fils d'Achille et le vainqueur de Troie. The serenus vow, the majestic periods, the tremendous name swept on. One is born upon the tide of music and greatness. One follows breathlessly the evolutions, the shiftings, the advances, and the retreats of the doomed quartet, as they tread their measured way to death and madness, through all the vicissitude of irresolution, passion, and jealousy, leaving at the end a child's soul shaken and exhausted, the first great rent made in the veil that hides the emotions of man and woman from the eyes of innocence. Didn't I understand the play at the first reading? Oh, certainly not. Haven't I put the great gathered experience of years into my recollections of it? No doubt. What is certain is that it gave me the first conception of tragedy, of the terror and complication and pity of human's life. Strange that is for an English child, that revelation should have come through Racine instead of through Shakespeare, but it did. I went to bed that night in a kind of daze, slept as if I had been drugged, and in the morning awoke to a new world, a world of excitement, a world in which everything was fierce and piercing, everything charged with strange emotions, clothed with extraordinary mystery, and in which I myself seemed to exist only as an inner core of palpitating fire. That walk that morning, the beauty of the forest, the sky, the deliciousness of the air, the delight of running, for the first time, I enjoyed these things consciously. I understand, I cried to myself. I understand at last. Life, life, life. This is life, full to overflowing, with every ecstasy and every agony. It is mine, mine to hug, to exhaust, to drain. At lessons, I went to them with a renovated ardor. Oh yes, I'd been a fairly intelligent pupil. I'd enjoyed learning and working in a kind of humdrum way. This was something quite different, something I'd never known. Every page of the Latin grammar seemed to hold some passionate secret, which must be mine or I should die. Words, how astonishing they were! The simplest bore with it such an aura of music and romance as wrapped me into fairyland. Geography, oh, to sit poring and wandering over an atlas. Here were pagodas, here the Nile, jungles, deserts, coral islands in the Pacific ringed around with lagoons, the internal snows of Himalayas, aurora borealis flaming at the pole, worlds upon worlds of magic revealed. Why had I never known of them before? History, those men, those heroes. How they looked, how they smiled as they were going through the block of the stake. And what had they died for? Faith, liberty, truth, humanity. What did those words really represent? I mustn't rest until I found out. And the peoples, the poor sheep-like peoples, those too must be thought of. But not yet. I dare not yet. There will be time enough for that later. I am not strong enough yet to look really at all those dreadful meaningless pains. I must put all that at the back of my mind. Now, I must grow strong. I must feed on the beauty and rapture in order to grow strong. And first of all, that face. There was that to look at, a long way off at the end of the table, passing one on the stairs, coming suddenly out of the door, talking to other people, listening to other people, and sometimes, rarely, reading out loud. Had I then ever looked at the face before? Why should the mere sight of it make my heart stand still? What was there so extraordinarily fascinating in watching it? Was it more satisfying when it was motionless, when one could imprint the light of the profile of one's memory, so fine and grave and austere, the delicate curl of the lip, the almost imperceptible and indescribably touching, faint hollow of the cheek, the fall of the lashes on the pale skin, the curve of the dark hair on the brows? Or was it then the expressions flowed over it so swiftly that one's eyes and one's heart were never quick enough to register to them? Laughter was never long absent from it, spreading from the slight quiver of a smile to a ripple, to the tempest of gaiety, passing like a flash of lightning, a flood of color, transforming, vivifying every feature. So I watched from afar, at meals especially when I sat some way off, but on the opposite side of the table. There were 3 tables in the big dining room, the 2 heads at the center one, set opposite to each other, as the foreign fashion is, in the middle of each long side. When there were guests and visiting professors, they sat on each side of the ladies. Special dishes were generally served for these honored ones, and if any remained over, the servant was told to hand it round to the young ladies. Once when this occurred, Mademoiselle Julie cross-examined the girls who had been served in this way. "Did you like that dish? Honestly now, as much as you like your English roast beef? No? Yes? You don't know? Ah, these English. They have no taste. And you, Olivia, what do you think of it?" My answer, "Delicious," was so fervent that she laughed. "Ha! Haven't we got a gourmet at last? But appreciation isn't all. There must be some discrimination too. Was there anything in the dish that you think might be criticized? Anything that might have improved it?" "I think," I murmured. "Yes, I would it. There was perhaps a thought too much lemon in it." "Bravo!" she cried. "You deserve encouragement. You shall be promoted." And at the next meal, after an anxious search, I found my napkin ring had been placed next to Mademoiselle Julie's own, and it was there, at her right hand, that I sat till the end of my time at Les Avants, unless a visitor or a professor sometimes separated us. And now she almost always helped me herself to one or others of special dishes, calling me Mademoiselle Gourmet, asking me my opinions, laughing at my enjoyment, teasing me for being still too English, because I wouldn't drink wine. "But perhaps," she said, "a vin ordinaire isn't good enough for you?" And perhaps indeed that was it. But there was no need for wine to intoxicate me. Everything in her proximity was intoxicating, and I was now, for the first time, within range of her talk. Mademoiselle's talk, I discovered later, was celebrated, and is not only amongst us schoolgirls, but amongst famous men whose names were whispered. I have no doubt been accustomed, or ought to have been accustomed, to good talk at home. But at home one was inattentive. There were all the other children who somehow interfered. It was on their level, in the turmoil that one lived. They were too distracting to allow one's talking any interest in one's elders and their conversation. When one did listen to it, it was mostly political, or else took the form of argument. My mother and my aunt, who was often in the house, were interminable and heated discussions in which my mother was invariably in the right and my aunt beyond belief inconsequent and passionate. We found them tedious and sometimes nerve-wracking. My father, a man in our eyes of infinite wisdom and humor, did not talk much. He was fond of explaining scientific or mathematical problems to us, or occasionally of inventing and making us take a share in some fantastic piece of tomfoolery. He would let fall from time to time a grim and gnomic apothegm, which we treasured as a household word, and would often calm a heated discussion by an apparently irrelevant absurdity. As for the people who came to the house, many of whom were highly distinguished, we admired them without listening to them. Their world seemed hardly to impinge upon ours. How different it was here! Mademoiselle Julie was witty. Her brilliant speech darted here and there with the agility and grace of a hummingbird. Sharp and pointed, it would sometimes transfix a victim cruelly. No one was safe, and if one laughed with her, one was liable the next minute to be pierced oneself with a shaft of irony. But she tossed her epigrams about with such evident enjoyment that if one had the smallest sense of fun, one enjoyed them too, and it was from her that I, for one, learned to realize the exquisite adaptation of the French tongue to the French wit. But her talk was not all epigrams. One felt it informed by that infectious ardor, that enlivening zest, which were the secret of her success as a schoolmistress. There was nothing into which she could not infuse them. Every subject, however dull it had seemed in the hands of others, became animated in hers. With the traditional culture of a French Protestant family, having contacts with eminent men and women in many countries, she had too a spontaneous and open mind, capable of point of view, fond of the stimulus of paradox. The dullest of her girls was stirred into some sort of life in her presence. To the intelligent, she communicated a Promethean's fire which warmed and colored their whole lives. To sit at table at her right hand was an education in itself.